At some point, I think you have to take them at their own words. Robert Reich says we should arrest Elon Musk. Brazil outlaws Twitter. Kamala Harris and Tim Walz in their past have said they do not believe in free speech. And now, in the pages of the New York Times, they ask, is the Constitution dangerous? It's the Will Cain Show, streaming live at foxnews.com. On the Fox News YouTube channel, the Fox News Facebook page right now. Comment streaming in on Facebook, on YouTube. Jump in to the Will Cain Show. Hit subscribe at Apple, Spotify, or on YouTube. He is the author of The Parasitic Mind. He is Professor Gad Saad. He's a friend here of the Will Cain Show, and these are some of our deepest conversations. And I love having him here. What's up, Professor?
Hey, how you doing? So good to be with you.
It's good to be with you. You often are very active on X. You're also what I would say is one of the people who are in the influencer circle of Elon Musk. What do you think now that people are, in America, calling for the arrest of Elon Musk? That's Robert Reich. I believe he was labor secretary under Clinton. And we're watching Brazil basically outlaw X.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. Look, I've talked about the distinction between deontological and consequentialist ethics. So let me break it down for you because it will be relevant to your question. Deontological ethics are absolute statements. So for example, if I say it is never okay to lie, that would be a deontological statement. If I say it's okay to lie to spare someone's feelings, then that would be a consequentialist statement. Now, for many things, we're all consequentialists, and that makes perfect sense. But when it comes to foundational values that define the West, those things have to be deontological. So you can't say, I believe in freedom of speech, but not for Elon Musk or Donald Trump. I believe in presumption of innocence, but not for Brett Kavanaugh. I believe in journalistic integrity, but not when it came to Hunter Biden's laptop. Once you apply a consequentialist ethic to a deontological position, you get the kinds of problems that we're seeing today.
So the interesting thing in part about what you had to say is we are all consequentialists to some point. And if we're all being honest and we look in the mirror, it is difficult to be principled. Meaning we all can give voice to principles, but living according to principle is very difficult. That's the challenge of life, to be a moral person. When you hear, and I'm going to read two of these. Abigail Schreier has this up in the Free Press. They've revisited this. Now, these are quotes from this is going to be 2020, I believe, for Kamala Harris, where she openly advocated for shutting down X. And she did it on multiple occasions. I think it was 2 or 3 different occasions. I think once from a debate stage, once with CNN's Jake Tapper. She openly called for shutting down X. And in Tim Walz's famous statement, now his is from 2022, was that free speech does not cover misinformation and disinformation. When you hear something like that from the two people running for president and vice president, the question, I think, is, what do they believe and what would they do, right? So are they consequentialists? I guess everybody is. Like, they don't believe in a principle against free speech. They just want to apply it when it's in their favor and not apply it when it's in their disfavor. So I guess the question would be, what would the...
Yeah.
Go ahead.
No, I got you.
Sorry
to interrupt you.
That's right. They're being consequentialists. So what would they be in an administration when it comes to free speech?
Well, look, I am Jewish. I grew up in very difficult circumstances in the Middle East. We faced execution. My parents were kidnapped by Fatah. So, we've seen it all in terms of actual victimhood. And yet I support the right of Holocaust deniers to spew the worst of offensive and insulting speeches, right? What could be more offensive and what could be more misinformation than to deny a historically documented event whereby 6 million people were, extinguished on an industrial scale level? But in a free society, you have to tolerate imbeciles, racists, falsehood spreaders, and so on. So that's how you walk the walk and talk the talk, right? If I, a Jewish person with my personal history, am willing to tolerate Holocaust deniers, then Tim Walz and Kamala Harris don't have much of a ethical position to stand on. But again, the reason why they do that is because they must find some consequentialist calculus to explain why they need to shut you down, right? Don't say that COVID is lab leak, because that's misinformation. Don't say whatever, that the Hunter Biden laptop was real, because then that would allow Donald Trump to ascend for a second term. One person's truth is another person's misinformation. So, for example, can men menstruate or only women menstruate? Which is the disinformation position, right? So, again, there is no such thing as forbidden knowledge in science, precisely because as long as you adhere to the scientific method, all bets are off. You pursue truth unencumbered by a consequentialist ethos. So I think what these two are doing is exactly what Orwell warned us against. Maybe it's even worse than what Orwell thought.
Well, if anybody questioned his intellect, I've been walking around the world saying menstruate, and he just taught us very clearly it's menstruate, that there's a U in there. It's not menstruate. Just a hick from Texas. Also, we have this information, like the whole thing, like what would they do? Well, they've done it. Like they did it in the Biden administration. We know what they did to suppress free speech. It wasn't just calls to arrest Elon Musk or whatever it may be. And one of the big leaders, I was just trying to look this up, so I had this name while I was talking to you. His name is Rob Flaherty. Rob Flaherty was one of the people who was integral to the whole disinformation campaign in the Biden administration. Punishing, identifying, limiting free speech. Rob Flaherty. He's one of the guys, for example, officials, I'm reading from Abigail Schreier in the Free Press, who reportedly pressured Facebook into censorship with the then director of Biden's digital strategy, Rob Flaherty. And who is Rob Flaherty now? Well, he is the deputy campaign manager for Kamala Harris. It's not as though this was a moment in time with COVID, a moment in time with 2020 election skepticism. This is someone who has benefited, been promoted in a leadership position for the person now running for president, Kamala Harris.
Right. I mean, we know what Kamala Harris thinks about the espousing of positions that are unpopular according to her calculus, right? You saw the clip that's been going around recently where she said, you can't allow people to just spew whatever they want without any controls or oversight. I mean, uttering those words should be enough to disqualify you as president of the United States. But yet again, because we now are so inundated with this consequentialist ethos, people don't even bat an eye. I mean, what could be more dangerous than to say things like, there has to be oversight over what people say. There has to be equality in the outcomes. As you said in your wonderful monologue, that's exactly what Marxism is. By the way, let me give you a great quote, which I don't think I've ever mentioned to you in our previous conversations. E.O. Wilson, the famous evolutionary biologist from Harvard who recently passed away, he studied social ants. Now, in social ant species, there's only one reproductive queen, and then all of the other ants are exactly equal, whether they are worker ants or soldier ants, right? So ant society is communistic. So when he was asked, Professor Wilson, what do you think about socialism, communism? His answer was, great idea, wrong species. Human beings are not communistic in their innate human nature. Some of us are taller, shorter, harder working, less hardworking. So to impose an end result of equality of outcomes on human beings is to literally be anti-human nature. So not only is it called Marxism, it defies evolutionary principles. It's very dangerous, and I hope that my neighbors to the south make the right decision on November 5th.
Talking to Professor Gad Saad here. By the way, the author of The Parasitic Mind, you got a new book, I believe, that you're working on, right?
I am
and
working
it's called
on a book
Suicidal
called Suicidal Empathy. And if I can just mention,
Yes.
because I want to promote my latest affiliation, I just accepted a visiting professorship and global ambassadorship in your country at Northwood University, the free enterprise university. So I'm very excited to be spending a year there.
Oh yeah, awesome, cool. Well, and you also did a paper. You've already done one paper on suicidal empathy. It's up for your subscribers. I saw on your X. Now I'm fascinated by this idea of suicidal empathy, and I was looking at some of the things you've had to say about it. All I really know so far is those two words juxtaposed against each other: empathy and suicide. However, something I don't know who can claim they've discovered any idea for themselves, but like one of the pieces of wisdom I feel like I've acquired with some age, Professor, is that I've learned through children and through myself, your greatest strength is your greatest weakness. in that trait, whatever that trait may be that makes you special, is also that trait that is your downfall. And so it's like management of that trait is your life's mission. So when I was thinking about suicidal empathy, Ray Dalio, a big thinker, he tweeted this out, something similar. He said, like, attributes, people have individual attributes. Whether or not they are a strength or a weakness depends upon their application. And obviously, application is circumstantial. And I just started thinking about that when it comes to you and the idea of empathy. Empathy is treated as a virtue, but modern society has made it abundantly clear how empathy can be a vice.
Yes. So let me explain this in a couple of ways, but thank you for the lead up. Just a small correction on my subscriber exclusive content. I shared a paper by someone else on empathy, not my own. It was part of the research I'm doing for my book on suicidal empathy, but thank you for that plug. So in the Sad Truth About Happiness, my last book, my happiness book, I talk about the inverted U being the most universal law of nature. Inverted U basically means too little of something is not good, too much of something is not good. It's exactly what Aristotle called the golden mean, right? He argued, look, if you are a cowardly soldier, that's not good. If you are incredibly reckless in your risk-taking, you're going to die and you're going to be a useless martyr. That's not good. Everything happens in the sweet spot, everything in moderation, as the ancient Greeks said, right? So that exactly applies to your point about personality traits. Perfectionism, for example, if you're not in the least bit perfectionist, your work will suffer because you won't have attention to detail. You won't be conscientious. If you're too perfectionist, as I am, you'll end up checking your galley proofs 45,000 times. God forbid there might be one comma out of place, and that's counterproductive. What if there is a comma out of place? You could have spent your time doing something else. Again, it's in the sweet spot. So now let's come to empathy. Empathy is noble as a virtue because we're a social species. Therefore, we have to have theory of mind. We have to put ourselves in the mind of another. We have to put ourselves in the shoes of another. And therefore, our emotional system has evolved because it confers upon us certain evolutionary advantages. But it has to be invoked within certain functional ranges, right? So take, for example, OCD, and I'll come back to empathy in a second. OCD is the misfiring of an otherwise adaptive process. And let me explain what I mean by that. It is perfectly adaptive for us to scan the world for environmental threats. I check the back door to make sure that it's locked, but I only check it once. I wash my hands when I come home once to make sure that if I shook hands with anybody who had a virus, I don't get contaminated. What happens with OCD? That adaptive mechanism misfires, right? As soon as the warning flag goes up and you tend to it, it goes back up again. So I spend 8 hours washing my hands and scalding hot water, and my skin is falling off. That's germ contamination, OCD. I keep checking the back door for 4 hours, even though one time would have been enough. So now let's apply that mechanism to empathy. It doesn't make sense that you be so suicidally empathetic so that as a means of demonstrating how virtuous you are, you literally kill your society, right? So if you target your empathy to the wrong person, Guatemalans who come in illegally are more worthy of our empathy than our own American vets. The homeless people who are defecating and fornicating in the children's parks are more valuable than the children who should be able to play in those parks void of that stimulus, right? And so what the book is about is what starts off as a noble emotion becomes quite dysfunctional when it's dysregulated. So that's the purpose. That's the point of the book.
But is that real empathy? Because like when I see that, I totally agree with, you know, the moderate mean or whatever is too much of any one thing is bad. Moderation is the key. But I also question whether or not that's real empathy. So you talked about it in terms of like you're projecting virtue. But if it's about you and your image or even your self-image, and that's the reason you're adopting a position, and by the way, that's usually the extent of the commitment, adopting a position. It rarely is accompanied by action, although some people are empathetic and employ that in their life. But if it's about you adopting a position and you are doing it as part of your self-projection, is that even really empathy?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in my first book ever, this one, an academic book, The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption, I talk about altruism and why altruism has evolved. And I argue that the Jewish philosopher Maimonides, nearly 1,000 years ago, talked about 8 levels of altruistic piety. The highest level, to your point, is when the altruist and the beneficiary of the altruistic act don't know one another, because then they can't reap the social rewards of having committed that altruistic act. So you're exactly right that even when we call something supposedly empathetic, oftentimes it's faux empathy that is only serving as virtue signaling currency. But nonetheless, if you ask those people, why are you holding those positions? They'll say, because all refugees are welcome, because no human is illegal. So we can debate as to whether they truly are feeling that empathy or whether it is faux empathy to gain social currency. But the reality is that it is a dysfunctional application of empathy, right? There is no logical reason why you should allow entry into your host society of millions of people who don't share a single one of your foundational values, right? So, for example, in Germany and in Denmark and in Sweden and in France and in Britain, certainly now in Canada, it's coming for you in the US. You have people that are coming from countries where there is orgiastic Jew hatred, where, for example, in Pew survey research, 95 to 99% of the surveyed people from those societies have endemic Jew hatred as part of their self-identity. So then it's not going to be surprising that you have rampant anti-Semitism on campuses. Demography is destiny, and people shake their heads. Why do we have increased Jew hatred? Well, import those values, and there are downstream effects.
Right. One more philosophical question before I kind of go back to the application to maybe current events or politics. So, you talked about the hierarchy of altruism, the different levels of altruism. It kind of made me think, does it matter though? Like if you do something good and you claim reward for it, you claim some social credibility for doing something good versus the guy who remains totally anonymous. And we do kind of internally know we all give a little more respect to the person that we don't even know, the presumption of anonymity out there. But does it matter if they're both effectuating a good, like they're doing something like, and let's use Donald Trump, because I think Donald Trump's a great example. Like if Donald Trump does something good, he's probably going to tell you about it, versus the guy who remains anonymous. Does it matter if the outcome's the same?
Yeah. So again, that's a great question. I talk about this again in my first book ever, The Evolutionary Basis of Consumption. I talk about philanthropy as a costly signal, meaning that when we engage in philanthropic acts, we typically engage in these acts because we want to have then advertise it's the Will Cain Oncology Center. It's rarely ever the XXX Anonymous Oncology Center, right? And incidentally, to your point, even when people supposedly engage in anonymous altruistic acts, believe me, their inner circles, the people who matter to them, will know that they did this act, right? So even though Will Cain may not know that I gave $100 million to cancer research, I'll be sure to tell all of my billionaire friends what a wonderful guy I am. And that's exactly why Maimonides 1,000 years ago said that it is almost impossible to reach this highest level of tzedakah. That's the Hebrew word, of this kind of such pure piety, because we're human beings. We care about our social standing. And one of the ways that I ascend the social standing is to show what a good guy I am. That's just part of human nature.
And either way, there's an oncology center. So I'm not sure.
And either way, there's an oncology
center. But I do think there's a distinction between that action and those that simply adopt a position to project virtue of empathy. Okay, you and I are having this conversation, and I know, and I think probably a lot of listeners and viewers would be able to pick up where you are, although you are unpredictable and you're not crackerjack box politics, where a lot of your leanings might be, and people certainly know where mine are. So we're having this conversation about consequentialism, and we're doing it through a lot of the positions which now have become championed positions of the left, like free speech. And we're going to come back in a minute to the Constitution. But Donald Trump is famously pragmatic. okay, is pragmatism not a more acceptable word for consequentialism? So in other words, you know, Donald Trump will make a deal. He'll understand now I'm not running on some hardcore pro-life position if I can't get elected. Donald Trump will make pragmatic / consequentialist decisions. So in that way, I mean, there you could say, well, and I think this is where you are going to go, but on foundational values like free speech, that's not the place to be consequential.
That's exactly it. So let's apply what you just mentioned to, say, academia, right? So some people would say we absolutely should have an ethos of forbidden knowledge. There are certain areas that you should never study because the consequences of finding out those things would be too hurtful or too dangerous, right? So don't do racial differences in IQ studies, even though you may honestly apply the scientific method, because if the results come out in a way that are difficult for the politically correct narrative, well, then some group will be marginalized. Don't study sex differences, or study sex differences as long as women are always shown to be superior on every task that's ever studied. God forbid, a million times, men are shown to be superior on some tasks. Please make sure to hide that data in your file drawer, because otherwise you're part of the patriarchy. No. Academia, the pursuit of truth, has to be unencumbered by consequentialist calculations. Because if we apply that, then we should have never studied ballistics and physics, because that led to the dropping of the atomic bomb. So we absolutely need to cancel physics, because there are simply too many nefarious consequences of understanding physics. By the way, in the parasitic mind, many of the parasitic idea pathogens that I discuss stemmed from that reflex. So, for example, social scientists have spent the last 100 years developing the disciplines of anthropology and sociology and economics without any biological underpinnings, because some really imbecilic academics thought that biology is simply too dangerous to apply to the human condition. Eugenicists used it to justify their cause. Hitler used it to justify, hey, there's a natural struggle between the races. We're the Aryans. Sorry, Jews, you lost. British social class applied social Darwinism to say, hey, we're the upper class. If you die from tuberculosis in your squalor, hey, that's just Darwinian. So let's now create a worldview where biology ceases to matter for human behavior, because at least we're being noble. Or as Plato said, the noble lie, right? No. When it comes to the truth, not a single millimeter is ever ceded.
Well, but that's not the case, right? Like what you just described, I would think we were at the apex of the moral truth. We're at the apex of all those things you just described. We are not studying those. Those are off the map. You do not learn more on those subjects. Today, we are probably at the apex of that ignorance.
Exactly. Well, ignorance. By the way, that's how I originally, I often say that writing The Parasitic Mind was really a 30-year journey. Starting from when I was in the Lebanese Civil War, but I've been a professor now this is my 31st year. When I was first trying to Darwinize the business school, what do I mean by that? Applying evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology to study economic decision-making, consumer behavior, personnel psychology. All of my colleagues were, what the hell is this? Biology doesn't apply to human behavior. And I'm thinking, how could it not apply to human behavior? You think biology applies to every single species except one called Homo sapiens? And so that's when I first started realizing that, Houston, we have a problem, right? Even very intelligent professors with many titles before and after their names could be completely lobotomized.
And it's interesting when you describe that. That's actually a little bit of what's been discussed when it comes to artificial intelligence. Like you talked about with physics and ballistics and the leading to the atomic bomb. There are people who are saying this AI thing is scary. We got to stop. We got to figure out a way for it not to continue as a field of study.
Right. I mean, there are two sides to the AI story. Some say that, the robots are going to kill us in 15 minutes once they're strong enough. Others say that's complete science fiction hype. So I'm not going to weigh in on, who's right, but it's the same reflex, right? It's basically saying don't
Right.
pursue some truth because the consequences of that truth will simply be too harmful. By the way, you may or may not remember this, and if your viewers haven't watched it, they should. The movie The Name of the Rose in the mid 80s that came out with do you know it, Will? Do you know the movie that I'm talking about?
No,
Name of the Rose.
never heard of
It
it. Name of the Rose. No.
it's with Christian Slater and Sean Connery. Sean Connery plays a monk, I think a Gregorian monk this is in the Dark Ages. All of these monks are dying from a poison and their tongues are blue. And he's wondering how did they die from that? And it turns out, just so I can fast forward, that the head monk had placed some Aristotle books dealing with humor in a forbidden library because he didn't want the monks to read any book on humor because humor is the work of the devil. But what they were doing, and so he had laced the bottom of the pages with a poison so that if a monk actually went in there and read the forbidden books, then he would be poisoned and get killed. That's the reflex of forbidden knowledge. I decide what you can read, what you could think, what you can say. And that's why I quoted that book in The Parasitic Mind. And that's exactly what Kamala Harris is doing. She is the head monk.
I love that. I love that analogy. Kamala Harris is the head monk. When you say, I decide, it's always, who's I? Who is the all-seeing, all-knowing, all-powerful decider of knowledge? And yeah, Kamala Harris is putting herself in the position of the head monk. So that takes me to the final thing here. I'm not shocked. And by the way, maybe in the spirit of you should never put any information or knowledge off the table. You should consider all perspective and all types of human thought. Maybe I shouldn't criticize the New York Times for publishing this, which is it's an opinion piece. I don't know who this person is. Jennifer Sazali. I don't know who that is. You may. Maybe she's in academia. She's a nonfiction book critic. So maybe not quite as esteemed as a professor. But the headline is, "The Constitution is sacred. Is it also dangerous?" And the subhead is, "One of the biggest threats to America's politics might be the country's founding document." For something like, I'd say, 1,000 words, she goes on to talk about that the Constitution. It's shocking for me, Orwell, as somebody who did study the law, and I know you're Canadian and the Constitution is uniquely American. For me, it is a sacred, sacred document. It is accumulation of, I think, centuries of knowledge. But the whole point of the Constitution is to thwart authoritarianism. Like it's a separation of power, it's checks and balances, it's certain rights are not subjected to democracy. Yes, democracy, meaning a protection of a minority. And she spends this whole thing Orwellingly twisting language to say, yes, it subverts democracy, but in the protection of authoritarianism. And to me, well, now we're talking about free speech or whatever. Increasingly, this is the end game. It's not the end game. Maybe it's the final hurdle to the end game, but the suspension of the Constitution.
Indeed. Look, in The Parasitic Mind, I have a quote, which I'm sure you know what I'm talking about, but I don't have it in front of me. The Reagan quote, where he basically says that every generation you have to be assiduous in defending freedom because every generation there are new folks who are trying to kill freedom, right? And so therefore you can't assume that it's going to be the default value forevermore, that you're going to have the freedoms and liberties that you take for granted. To that point, one of the reasons why some of the staunchest defenders of the Constitution, and to your point, I'm Canadian, yet frankly, I should be granted American citizenship yesterday. The reason why immigrants are some of the staunchest defenders of the Constitution and of the Western tradition is because we've sampled from the buffet of societies out there. And we know that the American experience is a bleep in history. It's an anomaly. It's a miraculous anomaly, but that's not the default value. The default value is for head monk Kamala to tell the rest of us how to dress, when to talk, when to eat, what to put in our bodies. That's the way societies have organized themselves since time immemorial. So it breaks my heart to see someone like this woman, I don't know who she is, who has benefited from all those freedoms, where people like me came and knocked on the door and said, please let us in, they're about to kill us. and she doesn't appreciate what she's got, what she has. What a shame.
Well, one other thing I'll explore with you here that I find fascinating, I'm sort of just freelancing this thought with you, which is always dangerous, but the Constitution is absolutely a subversion of democracy. When I say subversion, that makes it seem like it's secretive. It's not. It's overt. It is a document that says these certain rights will not be subjected to a majority vote. And that's why it's a projection of minority. So 51% can't decide to set aside freedom of speech. It's not going to happen because of the United States Constitution. In a pure democracy, it is pure power. You talked about the singular head monk, but it's also like tribal power. And that's how a lot of societies work, especially in third world countries. It's like whoever is the majority power, doesn't always mean by numbers because it often means by force. They dictate the terms of society over the minority. And it makes me wonder, like, that is sort of where you're pushing this. Either A, you have the ultimate confidence that you will always be on the side of the 51%, or you believe that somehow you'll be the one in power. And in that pursuit of power ultimately is brute. It's not at a voting booth. Like, it gets violent. It always does get violent. And I just wonder with somebody like Jennifer Salai, do you think in a brute fight for power, a violent fight for power, your side will be the victor? Because I'm not so confident that the side that asked for no guns, gender fluidity, legalization of drugs is the one that wants to reduce this to a fight of brute violent power.
Well, and listen, this kind of parasitic thinking that you're describing in this Jennifer lady is exactly why you have Queers for Palestine, right? I mean, in what world does it make sense where if my most fundamental identity that I present to the world, which is I'm queer, in what world would you then place all of your chips on the place that would put you through a 100% effective gravitation-based conversion method by logging you off the building as they do in Gaza for people who are queer, versus Tel Aviv, where you actually have one of the most queer friendly places. I mean, short of New York, San Francisco, and actually Montreal, my home city, Tel Aviv is probably right up there in the top 5 most queer friendly places. And yet people say, no, I'm putting all my chips with the society that would, throw me off rooftops. That's the kind of unbelievably myopic, parasitic thinking, quote thinking, that I rail against all day. But, I don't want to end this on a pessimistic note, but it seems to me that some of these folks are so impenetrable to reason. I know that in your monologue, you talked about using feelings rather than thought in choosing your president. Well, I talk about this in the parasitic mind, right? Most people want to deploy fast and frugal heuristics to make a decision, right? Well, my emotional system is much quicker. It's autonomic, right? I love Kamala Harris. I hate Donald Trump. Thinking is so hard, right? It's so effortful. It's so cumbersome. Best to simply use my emotional system. And I keep warning people, including my colleagues, you're trained as psychologists. Use your brain. Which policies are more in line with your values? They go, no, but she's so positive. She's joyful. She's fun. I'm going with her. We need a change. They're impenetrable to reason.
Yeah, my only hope in that monologue, talking about the people that ride along the surface, who will ultimately make that emotional decision is, and I don't, at this point, it's hard to find the undecided emotional reaction to Donald Trump. I think most people's emotional reaction has been defined to Donald Trump. So it's shocking to me that wherever they are, Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, I guess we have to implore them to think. I don't know how the emotions can be swayed at this point. You have to figure out how to think before 63 days expires and we have election day. I look forward to Suicidal Empathy.
Thank you.
Encourage everyone to check out Parasitic Mind and all his stuff. He's on X. Gadzad, he's great. Professor Gadzad. Love having you on the Will Cain Show. Thanks, Professor.
Thank you so much. Cheers.
All right, take care. Really, really smart guy. Really, really. But then forget smart. Overvalued adjective. Wise. Thoughtful. Mind.